Okay, I think we'll get started as the snow comes down. I expect people will be trickling in at a slower rate than the snow is actually coming down. But I want to get started with three quick announcements about the course mechanics again. So the first is regarding the paper. The full prompt is going to be posted by the end of the day on Friday. We're going to ask you to read a specific piece and write a 5-page essay answering some very specific questions about that piece that you need to argue. So we wanted to make sure you had this weekend to begin reading that piece. Because we're a week later in announcing the full assignment than we expected, and because we heard some seniors that have theses due in our original date, which I think was the 25th, we're also going to extend the due date to March 4th, which is just 1 week beyond what it initially says in the schedule. So that'll all be put online. It'll be on iSites, so you can follow up with all the details there. But I want to let you know of the plans for that. Second announcement is that we have a new section. I heard we had a good reports from the first week of sections, but one of the complaints was, particularly with some sections around 20 or 21 people, there were people that didn't want to talk, that wanted to talk and couldn't by the end. So there's a new section. It's at 2 p.m. on Friday, and we're opening up to a first-come, first-served enrollment. So if you'd like to switch into that section, shoot Mark Hannon an email. He's our head TF. His email's on the syllabus. So that'd be Friday at 2. It's also listed on iSites. An opportunity to have more intimate discussion, to get out of that enormous section where you can't speak right now if you find yourself in that situation, and if Friday is a better time for you. Finally, regarding those sections, as many of you know, and I'm sure you've been planning for it, this coming Monday is President's Day. And that means, President's Day parties, President's Day field trips, vacations. Probably some of you are dressing up like former presidents, doing what most of us do to celebrate President's Day. But officially, it means the classrooms will be closed on Monday. What we're going to do is hold Monday sections in Kirkland's Senior Commons Room. We have access for that. So that is the Monday section. However, if you do have plans for Monday, you're going to be somewhere else or out celebrating the presidents, then you have an option to go into one of the other sections. So if you'd like to attend the sections today or tomorrow, we would encourage you to do that if you can't get there on Monday. But this too will be posted on iSites, the SCR details for Monday. So any questions about those housekeeping measures? Okay, seeing none, Larry's going to start us off today.
Okay, so we're going to do just a couple minutes, I hope. Start at the beginning. So a couple minutes to just pull together the point we were going through last time. We were thinking about this idea, what corruption means. And I suggested that one way you can understand the idea of corruption is to think of it as a certain kind of influence, an influence that's in some sense bending somebody away from what that person ought to do or what that person wants to do. And we have to have a very clear metaphor for that, so I'm going to offer this metaphor. So, imagine the kind of metaphor from Lust for a Vampire here. As you imagine, this person having this hypnotic pull on someone else and drawing them away from what they're supposed to be doing. That's a kind of improper influence, we could say. Might call it kind of vampiric influence, which, as we know from other areas of popular culture, is basically corrupted love. Okay, so that's what that is. And in this context, we know the only solution to that kind of corruption is religion. That's the only way to free one from the power of that particular kind of corruption. But the point is, if you're going to think of corruption as this kind of influence, one point we drew from last time was that there's more than one kind of influence. There's the influence of a contract, and there's the influence of a gift. So an influence of a contract where we say, okay, in exchange for you doing this, I will give you that, quid pro quo. That's one kind of influence. But maybe much more significant, certainly much more significant in your ordinary, regular life, is the influence of a gift. You begin to create a relationship through a series of exchanges, series of interactions, which give you a clear commitment, bonding, obliges you to someone else. And we can think about these two kinds of influence as parts of two different kinds of economies. One I'm going to call the quid pro quo economy, and the other is the gift economy. And the part we didn't get to last time, but I want you to just reflect on a second, is what kind of economy do we think Washington is? And I was introduced to this idea when I was interviewing a former chairman of the FCC. And he was talking about the incredible way in which influence happens in Washington. And I said to him, so tell me exactly how it happens. And he said, most people have the idea that influence happens by somebody coming forward and saying, here's what I want you to do, and this is what I can do for you in exchange. He says that's never, never the way it happens. He says the typical way in which people tried to influence me as chairman of the FCC was something like this. I'd have a very bad day. Some terrible thing would happen in the press, people were attacking me in a certain way, and I'd get a call from the head lobbyist at AT&T, and he'd say, man, you want to go out for a drink? And we'd go out for a drink. And he would listen to me tell him how my life was terrible, how everybody was unfairly beating up. And the head lobbyist, the AT&T, would say, yeah, that's really awful. You really are completely justified in feeling outraged at this, and you really have our respect. So the whole point was the only thing that lobbyist was doing was trying to make this head of the FCC feel good. At the end of that drink or dinner or whatever, he wouldn't ask him for anything. He wouldn't say, would you please do this for us? He would say, feel better, feel better. And that was the end. And he said, you do that 3 or 4 times, and then this head of the FCC would say to me, the next time an issue came up and it affected that lobbyist, you can be damn sure my mind was in some sense thinking, how do I help that guy? How do I help that? Because he helped me. He helped me. Now, this basic mechanism of reciprocity, something we're going to be looking at next week, right? When Mazarine's next? 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, when we look at the psychology of how one is as a human. Most of you know that already, because most of you are humans. But the point is, you recognize that if you didn't have that built-in feature called the norm for reciprocity, or this psychological drive towards reciprocity, you wouldn't have made it this far. You wouldn't be here. So this is the critical thing to recognize, that this influence mechanism is most likely not the influence mechanism of a contract. It's an influence mechanism of a gift, and that gift economy is a critical part of how Washington works. Okay, so first point is there's not an influence here, there are influences here. So if you think corruption is about influence, at least recognize there are lots of different ways influence can matter. But number two, if corruption is not just about influence, if we can have a conception of corruption that's not focusing on the way somebody's being drawn away, hypnotized away from what they ought to be doing, if we can have a conception of corruption like I was thinking about it as improper dependence, and the historical material that Zephyr Teachout gave us was a way to think about the framers' focus on avoiding corruption by avoiding improper dependence, then here too we can have a certain kind of metaphor. It's not quite as racy or compelling maybe as the vampire metaphor, but let's think about this. I know this is a little bit of a old technology for most of you, but imagine, you knew what a radio was, and they used to have dials on radios. It wasn't numbers, a dial on a radio. And so we have broadcast towers. So the way that technology worked is that the radio has got to be convinced and focused exclusively on the one channel in order to play something on the radio. It depends upon the broadcast from that one channel. And what sometimes happens, you might have experienced this as you drive a car and play with the radio, is that gets competing. Kind of tricky the way I did that, right? But the point is, it's a competing broadcast, right, that draws them away, draws the radio away from being able to play for you precisely what you want. It gets distracted. And this is the model of improper dependence. The exclusive focus that was intended is lost. And my claim was that if we look at the history of the United States, our republic, a representative democracy, was meant to have a certain kind of exclusive dependence. At least the House was to be dependent upon the people alone. So if this is the model, the problem that has emerged is that increasingly there is, like that influence of a different radio station pulling the different broadcasts, pulling the radio station away from playing what it was supposed to be playing, this conflicting dependence draws the members of Congress away from the thing they're supposed to be focused on. So this is a dependence too. And if you think about the extraordinary amount of time that members spend in the process of raising money from the people that they need to fund their campaigns, 30 to 70% of their time, it evokes an image of another psychology professor from Harvard, Skinner. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box, right? So you could teach animals. I, picked a pigeon. It might have been more appropriate for the analogy to pick a rat, but whatever. Animals to do very complicated things, knowing which buttons they need to push or which levers they need to pull in order to get the sustenance they need. The thing to recognize is that this is the picture of the modern American congressperson, as they spend 30 to 70% of their time learning which buttons they need to push in order to get the sustenance they need to run their campaigns or to help their party get back into power. That is a conflicting dependence. And that conflicting dependence is different and conflicting from a dependence on the people alone, so long as the funders of campaigns are not in any sense representative of the people. And again, to be clear, the funders of campaigns are not in any sense representative of the people. Tiniest slice of the 1%, basically about 0.05% of the population, about 150,000 Americans are the relevant funders of campaigns. It turns out that's about the same number as people are named Lester in the United States. The internet told me that. I know it must be true. So 150,000 number of Lesters. This is why at this TED Talk I called America Lesterland. That's where we live, a country like Lesterland where the Lesters control because the Lesters are funding these campaigns. My point is this is a corruption. Let's call it a dependence corruption. It's a corruption of the dependence intended by the framers when they framed the constitutional regime we have. Now, this phrase, the framers, is very significant, at least within the realm of the court, at least for those people who call themselves originalists, which I said at least 5 at different points have tried to assert they were. And the punchline, the conclusion of what I wanted to say on Tuesday was to be offered as a kind of criticism of the jurisprudence of these originalists when it comes to this question of corruption. And the criticism is of 2 forms. Number one, if by corruption we're referring to influence, then what we know is that there's more than one kind of influence. And so the conservatives' obsessive focus on quid pro quo corruption and suggestion that that's the only relevant kind of corruption is a crudely narrow view of what corruption is or how influence actually matters. That's point 1. But point 2 is that influence corruption, or corruption conceived of as a certain kind of influence, isn't the only kind of corruption. Dependence corruption is a corruption too, and from the framing sources that I pointed to last time, indeed, it was the most common kind of corruption that they were referring to. This improper dependence was spoken of at least 5 times as often as quid pro quo corruption. So by the word corruption, the framers meant both individual and institutional corruption. And to the extent the conservatives or the originalists restrict the scope of corruption to quid pro quo corruption, they are betraying that commitment to an original understanding of what the word might mean. Now, why would this matter? Or how would this matter? Well, How many of you have heard of this case that's now going to be decided probably in the next 3 weeks in the Supreme Court, the McCutcheon versus the FEC case? Okay, so in this case, the question the court will decide is whether aggregate limits on campaign contributions are constitutional. So right now, individuals can give up to about $5,000 to a candidate in an election cycle, once in the primary, once in the general. But the total amount of money you're allowed to give to all federal candidates and parties and PACs in an election cycle is capped. You're going to be very upset to hear this, but it turns out you're only allowed to give about $126,000 every election cycle to politicians. I know that feels like a very significant constraint to many of you, but that's the reality. The law stops you from giving more than about $126,000 to politicians to fund their campaigns. Now, Sean McCutcheon, has challenged that law. And he's challenged it by saying restricting him to just $126,000 violates the First Amendment. And it violates the First Amendment because his contribution is a kind of speech. The only justification for restricting political speech is, quote, corruption. And contributing more than $126,000 in aggregate is not corruption. Now, his argument is pretty strong if corruption is influence corruption only, and the only relevant kind of influence is quid pro quo. Because if you think, all right, let's imagine he wants to give $500 to every Republican candidate running for Congress. You know, a contribution of $500 is not corrupting to that particular candidate. There's no congressperson who's going to sell his or her vote for $500, so it's impossible to imagine that individual contribution of $500 is an instance of quid pro quo corruption. And what Sean McCutcheon says is, so if each of these individual contributions is not corruption, how does it become corruption when you add them all together? And if the only kind of corruption is quid pro quo, my claim is that those limits would be unconstitutional. And the prediction is the Supreme Court is going to strike down those limits because the conservatives on the court think the only relevant kind of corruption is quid pro quo corruption. But the relevance of everything we've been talking about Tuesday and just now is if you had a different conception of corruption, if you thought corruption could be dependent corruption, how would that same case be decided? And here's one additional bit of facts to help you answer that question. In this case that came from the state of Montana, where the state of Montana upheld limits on corporate speech, basically ignoring the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision. In the course of this opinion, the court pointed to evidence about what happens when you change limits on contributions. When you basically go from states where contributions are limited to states where there's no limits on contributions. And what the data show is that the business model of fundraising changes dramatically when you move to a world of no limits on contributions. And they cited this evidence that showed percentage of campaign contributions from individual voters drops sharply from 48% in states with restrictions on corporate spending to 23% in states without. So what they're saying is if you eliminate all limits, you say anybody can contribute, the candidates try to raise their money in the biggest chunks they can, so they turn to corporations and large contributors to raise the money. They don't raise the money from small contributions or from individuals, so the individual contributions drop dramatically. And the claim is then, if you eliminate the cap on contributions, if you could say you can give much more than $126,000 to all candidates, you can give as much as you want as long as you don't give it in chunks bigger than $5,000 per candidate. That data would suggest that the number of funders of federal campaigns would drop too. So the number of funders would drop, And from this perspective of dependence corruption, what that means is dependence corruption would increase because you're further concentrating the number of people who are the funders of campaigns. So if McCutcheon reverses that limit, we're not going to be in a world of 150,000 funders. It's going to be a world of no more than 35,000 funders, which the internet tells me is the same number as the number of people named Sheldon. So whether it's Lesterland or Sheldon City, the point is, from this perspective of dependence corruption, we can understand the way in which the limits on aggregate contributions could be related to reducing dependence corruption, a version of corruption that at least I think the originalists should recognize. Okay, so the punchline is, if original meaning of corruption includes dependence corruption, an originalist should permit Congress to pass laws to reduce it, laws like the law which limits total contributions at issue in McCutcheon. Okay, that's all I'm going to say. Happy to answer questions while Bill switches out and puts up his machine. Or we can show more of that movie, you know, the vampire movie, which, yeah.
So the statistic you gave, the 48% and the 20%, do you know if the absolute number contributed by individuals actually changed?
The average contribution goes down, and the total that's raised from individuals goes down. And it's not so much because individuals wouldn't be giving it, but because the fundraisers for the campaigns don't waste their time asking for small bites when they can get big bites. They raise money in the biggest chunks they can, because there's only so much time, so they want to get as much bang for buck as they can. And so that's what's explaining that dynamic. Yeah.
What percentage of all federal campaign contributions come from the top 0.05%?
I'll get you that number.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to ask an overly specific question. It sounds ridiculous when I say it. You were saying about 150,000 people are relevant. It drops to about 35,000. I was wondering, how do we in general get to that level?
Yeah, so when I say 0.05%, 150,000, those are the number of people who are giving at least $2,500.
Okay.
So I call them the relevant funders in the sense that if you're a political campaign manager and you're thinking, how do I attract contributions, you're worrying about at least that class, probably people giving more than that, but at least that class. So 0.26% of America gives $200 or more. 1/4% gives $200 or more. 0.05 gives the maximum amount in one cycle, $2,500. 0.01, the 1% of the 1%, gives $10,000 or more. And in the last election cycle, 0.000042%, which is about 157 Americans, gave 60% of the super PAC money contributed. So it's a very small number of people who are contributing the largest chunk of this money. Yeah.
Having just worked in the fundraising side of the campaign with J-Term, those are exactly the people that we target. $2,500 enough. The candidate gave them a personal phone call or went to their home, and that's how it works. It's how it actually plays out. It's real.
Yeah. So what's the? I'm blanking on the Minnesota senator.
Oh, Feingold? Or?
No, yeah,
Recent one?
yeah, current one. SNL.
Yeah. Franken. Franken.
Yeah. So my wife picked up the phone the other day, and Al Franken was on the other line. Not RoboCop, not RoboCall Al Franken, but the real Al Franken, right? You know, there's no chance that he was expecting we were going to give more than $500. But there he spent 25 minutes on the phone with my wife trying to get her to give, while she was lecturing him about the corruption of the political. But, you know, when you sit back and think, Al Franken is wasting his time calling people begging for $500 contributions, it's really...
As a Minnesotan who is represented by him, this is how he gets his fundraising. It's almost all out of state. He doesn't get much from in-state. It's big contributions through phone calls like that.
So out of the relevant 150,000 funders, they don't all contribute to multiple candidates. Like some of them are just contributing 2,500 to 5,000. these people are going to start contributing to it.
Well, it's not necessarily the people who are giving just $2,500, but the people, very large millionaire type people who could afford to be giving $1,000 every single Democratic candidate. So you want to go out to, you're the head of the DNC or the RNC's finance committee. You go out to these people and you say, look, this is what we need you to do. We need you to write a check to every single candidate. $1,000, $2,500 check. And now you can do it because a $1,000 check to every single candidate is $400,000 in the House, another $100,000 in the Senate. So $500,000 you can be giving directly to candidates. And you can't do that today. You can only give up to $150,000. So that whole business model strategy for how to raise money is not what they engage in. But that's what they would engage in. That's what they say they will engage in. If that's what the exchange do. So that's the basic prediction that falls. Now, does it fall to Sheldon City? Well, it'd be fun if it did. It's such a great rhetorical line, but it'll fall, and it'll be even worse than it is. Okay, one more question.
Yeah. So the stat you showed is that if you got rid of the cap, it would go from 150,000 to 47%, 20%. Is the inverse true? So if you lowered the cap, you
Yes.
also. So I guess my question is, how do you kind of decide what the cap should be? Because you're constraining speech, the argument would be, but you're moving towards a John or Mike Lane in that way. So how do you think through that?
Yeah, so the court's analysis for what that cap must be is not how many people does it produce as contributors. It's, is it plausible that somebody would believe that there's a quid pro quo involved with that contribution? And originally the court said, yeah, $1,000 contribution, that was the Buckley versus Vallejo case. That's the kind of level where somebody could believe a quid pro quo was going on, so that's a fair cap. And it's not clear now what the court would say about a $1,000 contribution. So the limit is being set by basically Congress saying this is the lowest amount the court would believe is involved in a quid pro quo, quid pro quo kind of corruption. And so again, if that's the only kind of corruption, then that's the only plausible limit, and you don't have any limit on aggregate contributions or super PACs or any other things that are involved in the current economy.
So on this very point, on this Friday at 3 p.m. in the law school, there's actually somebody who's presenting a paper from one of the California schools at the law school that had a lot of data on, after the last 2 election cycles, how did limits from different states relate to, it was actually the super PAC donation. So if you had like a $1 million donation in Texas for super PAC, did that mean you had less small contributors? And it seemed to be a lot of evidence that that was the case. But if you're interested at 3 p.m. This Friday in the law school, assuming we don't get snowed out, that could be something to look into. So building on what Larry said, if you take Lessig and Teachout's account of personal influence, of the way in which hints, the way in which a gift economy can work, in the first instance that raises a sort of problem. And the problem is that the influence that's going on isn't legible. It isn't something that's put down on contract. It's not something you post. You don't say, hey, everybody, I'm going to go and have a drink with the FEC guy tonight. And when we think about trying to hedge in these sorts of influences or have them have a proper scope, it's going to be very complex and very hard to think about balancing that out, balancing these unlegible things. So obviously, in a free society, we're not going to say you can't have drinks with somebody else at the bar after work. We're not going to say, you can't make a phone call to this person. The question is, what can we say to make, and what sort of institutions can be designed to either drown out this sort of influence or have it play off one another in a way that can actually be productive. I also want to suggest that this account that Larry's given us of the gift economy has important implications for our understanding of institutional morality. So we began by pointing out in the first 2 weeks that it's at least the case that general morality might not be the same as institutional morality, that institutions might generate particular moral claims that wouldn't be on us as general citizens or as individuals in our daily life. And what's interesting, what's suggested by these economies of influences that are legible, is that you might find yourself in situations where general morality actually is in tension with institutional morality. a situation where the kind of virtues that we think make for good friendship, that these are genuinely moral things. We look for loyalty, fidelity, reciprocity. These are genuine moral goods. These are genuine things we would expect from one another. But they can prove corrupting if people end up in positions of power where what's required of that position for an institution to operate well is independent judgment, is objectivity. Then precisely these virtues of personal relationships are going to be in tension with some of the demands and claims of the institutional morality. And this can create a kind of moral dissonance. And this is something we're going to also have to think about when we do our week on psychology. The third thing I want to remark on regarding this concept of a gift economy is the fact that there's actually a much larger analog in political economy literature, in the larger way nations function. So the gift economy isn't just a question of how do friends exchange favors, but in fact, that sort of paradigm can be the basis for an entire economy. And it's those sorts of economies, in fact, that we get our basic understanding of corruption. So even the quid pro quo corruption that we talk about, if you ask someone on the street, what's corruption? And they talk about a bribe, or they talk about some corrupt third world dictatorship. In fact, if you look at the characteristics of those countries, they look a lot like these sorts of gift economies. We think about impartiality as being very important, but when you look at the political economy of what we're going to call in a second natural states, in fact, impartiality is one of the most difficult things to engineer. And what I want to talk about briefly is a framework. We've talked about Doug North, the great institutional thinker. One of his latest books is with two other colleagues, Wallace and Weingast. And it's really a brilliant book. It's called Violence and Social Orders. We're not going to touch on 98% of the themes, but there's 2% of things they introduce there that's extremely useful for our purposes. And that is that they develop this, I think, very persuasive larger typology of two sorts of very common political economic systems in the modern world. And the first system they describe or characterize as a natural state. And one reason they call it as a natural state is they actually think it plays on our natural sociability. We as human beings are historically, if you think about the evolution of human society and perhaps even the evolution of human nature, we're wired to understand personal relationships and interacting with thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people, having objectivity that you have to exercise over people you've never met before. This is something of a new thing in the history of human civilization. But the more natural and the more predominant political structures that we've seen in history have been what they're characterizing as a natural state. And that's where you have some ruler, some elite. And what they do is they manage the economy and economic opportunities in such a way that they can get a network of friends and loyal factions that because they're distributing these sorts of economic opportunities or rents, as we'll talk in a minute, they keep their loyalty. And this means that economic and political power are tightly intertwined. And it also means that these networks of personal relationships are the lifeblood of an economy. So it really depends on who you know, on working your way up through the system, and that this is, in fact, the way that a lot of states in the face of the earth work. So there are benefits to this. There could be benefits. What are some of those benefits? This is an open question. We typically think of these as terribly corrupt states, but let's admit for a second that they might be useful for some things.
Well, imagine that there were actually corrupt individuals who would siphon away your money. So if you have a personal relationship with others, you may be able to avoid that.
Yeah, so personal knowledge is one way of trying to solve this problem of dishonest behavior or exploitation or not knowing whether you can trust somebody. Maybe you don't need all these incentives aligned. I just know that person. I know that guy or that girl, and she's going to be aligned with my interests because of my personal knowledge.
Creating rents prevents violence.
Yes. So if you've been following Afghanistan there, we've spent billions of dollars there. And a lot of what we're trying to do is buy off enough dangerous people in that society, dangerous warlords, to say, hey, we understand you can make things get really bad here really quickly, and we're going to try to bring you into the ruling coalition. So it's a way of buying off people. But if the alternative is violence, this is pretty important.
Probably a lot of cohesion if everybody's sort of allied behind one another.
There can be some exactly. So there can be some cohesion, and this sort of one of the flip sides of this, and cohesion is the right word, is when when this coalition breaks down, then you're in a lot of trouble. So in Syria right now, for a long time, the regime there has basically had a coalition, which was a minority coalition, but had enough positions of power. They're able to control the actual access to politics and economics. And all of a sudden, they realize that if they fall down, they're all going to be slaughtered. So you have this terrible civil war in Syria with two balancing acts of two possible coalitions, and you need to keep cohesion there because this concern about factions in there, when the other faction wins, you can eliminate the other party. So you have this delicate balance of power. So we try to control violence, make cohesion, use the personal knowledge to make decisions where incentives might not be aligned based on our understanding of their personality. Is there another?
Because legislations are more proactive unless it's mandated.
It could be, yeah. So maybe you have, because you have a more personal relationship, you don't need to deal at arm's length. You don't need to have these complicated bureaucratic procedures. You just call up the person and say, hey, here's what we need to do, and get stuff done. So I think these are the benefits, if we can call them that. And this is why they continue in so many places around the world. But what are the costs? Just at a very general level, what are the costs of this sort of thing, and how big are they?
In the case of unemployment insurance, say, you wouldn't, if there were a case of a natural state, basically the powerful individuals would simply be providing unemployment insurance to their clients rather than in a non-discriminatory way. So public benefits and poverty alleviation methods would be thrown out the window.
So public goods provision in general, it's not clear you have an incentive as a government to provide these to people outside of your network, outside of your gift economy. Why should a random poor person get money that could be used to keep you in power in more effective ways? Now, if they want to get access, they better join the party. They better get in with your program. So it's a way of, it can have negative consequences, a lot of public goods provisions for people that we think are deserving but aren't friends of the people in power. So you have these Byzantine, dense networks where to get something done in that village, you need to go through this elder who can only be contacted and is loyal to this regional chief. So you have these complex things, and it's also, it's not very legible. So it's hard to say who's responsible, as a president, who's responsible for this? Well, it's that guy's cousin's brother's uncle, aunt, son, that sort of thing. So this is also a cost.
An empirical pattern that we observe in many less developed countries is that these ruling coalitions try to create a lot of rents that they can distribute among the members of their group, or in other words, they're trying to create transfers from the outgroup to their own group.
Right. So the big question is, how do you pay for this patronage network? How do you keep everybody aligned? And the argument that's made over and over is that what these people end up doing is they need to find some big money pot. Oftentimes that's natural resources, that's an oil wealth, or it can be some sort of other thing that's easy to monopolize. And you don't get your money from taxes, you get your money from controlling these economic sources of wealth, and then you have to cut everybody a piece of that pie. But the kind of flip side of the implication of that is you're not going to get a very dynamic economy, because what it means is if somebody else wants to found a business, wants to create some startup, wants to do something that would produce a lot of wealth, first of all, you don't like it because you can't control it. Second of all, those people could become powerful and depose you. So this problem of factions ends up being tightly intertwined with the problem of economics, that if somebody's not with you, they could very well be against you, and you use and manipulate the economy to keep everybody on your side and keep those people not on your side out of any possibility of power. So there's little accountability. The unconnected are exploited. You have a lot of limits on innovation, limits on access, and it's important not to gloss over this. What do you spend your time doing? You spend your time investing in sucking up to other people rather than developing skills, rather than starting new companies. Luigi Zingales, who we'll read later in this course, talks about a certain time growing up in Italy and going through grad school there, people saying, you better, they called it carrying the professor's bag. You should be carrying that professor's bag more. You should help him out, because that's the only way you can advance in this area of Italy at that time. And Zingales recounts in a later essay how he wanted to get ahead by writing good papers, not by being some other professor's assistant. And not even assistant, but I mean, some of the examples of the kinds of things they were asked to do were absolutely ridiculous for sort of a actual professional who's aspiring to excellence. So this is, I think, a picture that is pretty common. And the kind of, on the one stand, we talk about these as corrupt arrangements because they have all these unfortunate public outcomes. And the irony is that sometimes corruption could improve things. So if it's the case in these third world developed countries, it's a corrupt system. And if you corrupt the corrupt system, you might actually make it a little better. So these are sort of important terminological things to keep in the background. But what North Wallis and Weingast contrast this to is this notion of an open access order. And the open access order is distinguished by a few things. One is that everybody has literally equal access. So you have equal rights, you have equal access to the courts, you have rule of law that applies to all. You have, as an intricate part of the sustainability of these sorts of systems, competition in both economics and politics in a way that can actually reinforce one another. We're going to talk a lot about this. And you have success ultimately linked to the quality of services. So if you're a politician, to get elected, the idea is you need to do things for people that are actually in the public's interest. If you're a business, you need to provide goods and services at better prices with higher quality. And this is the ideal that North Wallis and Weingast contrast the natural order with. And at the heart of this is what their notion of, and it's striking that they use this term, it's impersonal administration. So if I go to collect an unemployment benefit, I go down, I fill out forms, and the criterion, the requirements, are things that have nothing to do with who I am as a personal relationship with anyone in the bureaucracy. It says, how long have you been unemployed? What was your previous job? What's your age? What's your things? And it's a formula. It's a formula that anybody can come in and bring their own abstract qualifications to, and that's a criterion on which these sorts of things are decided. So this notion of a gift economy ends up being directly opposed to what North Wallis and Weingast want to call the most distinctive factor of a vibrant open access political economy. It's precisely, so when we think about what is the normative ideal by which we're calling something corrupt, their claim, in this book at least, is that this issue of impersonality is essential to open access orders, and it's precisely the personal relationships that Lessig was talking about that would be a deviation or a complicated factor in trying to make this sort of thing work. The final thing I want to highlight from them is this claim that open access orders have politics and economics deeply intertwined with each other, that their benefit is that they limit the stakes of power, so when you lose, the other faction isn't going to burn your house down and kill your family. They create perpetual organizations, which I want to talk about in a minute, that are able to endure through these sorts of changes of political government. You allow a much larger number of people to organize because you say, we're not worried that you're going to depose us. You can actually go out there and found new businesses, create new civil society organizations, whatever. We're not going to restrict those. You get more effective competition in public office and more effective competition in the economy. So this is their presentation, as it were, as to what we might aspire to create non-corrupt political economic systems. And the challenge is, I think on paper this is very convincing. This is a compelling vision for what a good order might look like. But the actual balances of power, it turns out, are really complex to engineer. And they give I think, a very nuanced account of the historical development of these things and how it is that you play economics and politics off one another. Which brings us to Wallis's piece today that we read. I think this is a fantastically interesting piece of American history that we don't often talk about. And at the center of that, of course, is the canal system of America. The canal system, which is part of the larger public transportation system in the United States, you remember the numbers? How much money was spent on internal improvements in the United States in the national level from basically the founding of the Republic to 1860? 60 million or so. And how much was spent at the state level? 450 million. So, order of magnitude larger at the state level. And what was the challenge, though? When they needed the background of this is that canals are going to be extremely useful for the economy of the United States. They're probably a good public investment. Why did it take a while for them to get started? What was the challenge in actually implementing them? What was the political economic challenge?
The states that didn't have the canal in them didn't want to pay for it. Like, they just wanted whoever was going to use it to pay for it.
So this is a general problem we can generalize to everybody in the state. If I'm not using it, if I'm not benefiting from it immediately, why should I pay for it? So if I'm in a state where we're all getting taxed, but the canal is only on the southern part of the state, people in the northern part of the state aren't happy. And for a long time, canals don't actually get built because of that, because you have a coalition there that's able to veto these. How do they work around that?
They either only tax those who are going to directly benefit, or in later cases, they don't tax at all and wait for the revenue to make up for the costs.
Yeah, so there's this, a nice equilibrium, a strategy develops, and the strategy is, first of all, we'll move to a use-based tax. And there's various ways, you can decrease property tax, you can have an ad valorem tax, you can have actual taxes on the canals or the highways that are built. But the more ingenious solution was, let's float bonds where we don't have to tax at all. So we can tell all the citizens, hey, this is going to be free. These are going to be financed by bonds. The revenues that these roads and canals generate will pay for the bonds, reimburse people, and everybody's going to win. And with this final solution, the building boom is off. And a lot of the building boom is actually very successful early on. But there are these lingering questions. First of who pays. They figure out how to make that politically feasible. Then they ask who's liable for the debt and who's going to benefit. So these are the solutions we just talked about. But what happens? What's the problem?
The debts become a pretty serious issue.
So you rack up these enormous debts, and what's actually happening is when you think about the incentives that are enshrined here, you have entrepreneurs that are part of these projects. They set up these canals, and the deal is it's sort of like a heads I win, tails you lose deal. So if the canal's successful, then I, as an early investor and somebody who helped set it up, am going to make a lot of money. If the canal fails, then I don't lose anything, but the state still has to pay the bonds because everybody's on the hook for those. So this was, in many ways, sort of one of the most important big institutional crises in the first 70 years of the American Republic was how do you deal with what ended up being a perverse set of incentives in the way these states worked. And what happened was we got 94 new state constitutions and literally hundreds of amendments because these states were all of a sudden going bankrupt. There was a recession. There had been this boom, not unlike our recent housing boom. There had been a canal boom, a road boom. And when it all finally crashed down, the citizens were left holding the actual obligations. So one of the main provisions was you had limits on debts in a lot of states, and the necessity explicitly in a lot of these constitutions of dealing with ways and means. That is, let's think down the road, how are we going to provide for these things, and oftentimes requirements that you raise the money up front. There's a related story about banking. And this is where I think it becomes really important for North Wallis and Weingass's larger story. How do you start a bank in the early American Republic?
You start giving out money and holding on to it.
No, you'll be thrown in prison for that. You can't give, you can't, you're just a guy. You can't give out money, okay.
You asked for a charter?
A charter, okay. So to start a bank, you need a charter. You need to become you need to be incorporated. Now, you're right. How do you become incorporated today? Today, you fill out a form, and the form has some very basic information. It says, what's the name of your company, how many shareholders are you, what's your managing agreement, whatever. You send that in the state stamps it, and you're a corporation. At this point, to become a corporation, and this is a legacy, this is sort of the transition in America from the traditional, more natural state forms of political order, you need to go to the legislature. The legislature has to pass a law that says, we are going to make your group a corporate body. So all corporation goes through legislative processes, which in the first instance means you need to be politically connected because you actually need to get a law passed. And you can think of the rationale initially for this is that if you think corporations or other ways of organizing people can provide factions that actually challenge the stability of a political order, then you want to have oversight, from a legislative body to say, we're gonna know exactly who the corporations are out there, we're gonna define their terms, and this is a tightly controlled situation. But it has this unfortunate thing that you need to have political connections to actually get a business off the ground, to get a bank started or any other sort of corporate body. So with minor exceptions, Massachusetts and one of the other northern states, to get to this earlier, political connections matter a lot for economics in the early republics. And all the debates about the national bank, the debates about a lot of these public works are all about who's benefiting at who else's expense. And it's this question, can we open this process up to allow more competition and more entry, or is that going to destabilize the existing political order? There were some cases of what we might call explicit corruption. Wallace talks in Arkansas and Mississippi. You'd have these sort of conspiracies where a handful of people would come to the legislature. They would create this sort of sweet deal. They would go on to take an enormous amount of money for themselves and leave, without any other plan, leave the taxpayers holding the bag. But by and large, this was sort of a lot of these were honest investments, but the incentives set up were such that it led to these bankruptcies and lack of responsibility and accountability. What was discovered at a certain point in the mid-19th century, and this is something that happened simultaneously in England and France, is that it might be possible to decouple business and politics. That is, allow business projects to bear their own risk, have their own capital at stake, and not have the political players and the taxpayers involved. And you can do this by allowing general corporations, general charters, and you don't need political oversight of that. But the sort of condition on this is we need to be really sure that this isn't going to harm politics by creating all these factions out there that have moneyed interests that are going to come back and corrupt the fledgling American democracy. So a lot of states, as part of these amendments, as part of these revisions, passed general incorporation. And what general incorporation means is that you can just come as a citizen, a group of citizens, fill out paperwork, and everybody gets access. And this is this mirrors this notion of open access to political competition, but also open access to economic competition. In the UK, when they do this, they go from 7,000 to 20,000, or pardon me, 700 to 20,000 corporations in just 20 years. In France, you get a similar explosion. So you have a lot of pent-up desire for doing business projects, and this just explodes in this period. And many people sort of see it as part and parcel of the larger economic growth in the United States. Now, the concern with relation to money and politics is sort of encapsulated by what we saw of Smith the other day, that people seldom meet together, businessmen seldom meet together, except that it arises in a conspiracy against the laity. This is something articulated another way by George Bernard Shaw, who was a committed socialist at the beginning of the 20th century. This is a continual concern of the way in which professional organizations, economic interests, corporations might conspire against people who don't have the same knowledge as them. And the typical answer as to why this doesn't happen is an account of competition. So our account is that markets end up enforcing a discipline and a kind of oversight, because what happens is if you don't provide a good and service that somebody else can provide better, they're going to provide it at lower cost, you're going to end up losing out. So you're actually responsible and accountable to the people consuming things. More entrance means more choice for consumers, more competition. I think that is a compelling 1.0 account of how markets work, and there's a lot of benefits to that sort of oversight. But Joseph Schumpeter in the middle of the 20th century asked this big question, which is, why don't we see more monopolies? Because it turns out when you trace out the logic of a lot of industries, it makes sense to have takeovers, mergers, conglomerations, and as these happen, you also have more influence. And what was his basic answer as to why we don't have more monopolies? Why don't we see more out there in the world?
His phrase was creative destruction, that technological advance kind of messes everything up, so shakes things up.
Yes. So for a long time, the Bell Labs and AT&T were the dominant American phone player, and we thought a lot about how to keep them in check and not have them have disproportionate market influence and raise prices on consumers. And by 1984, when AT&T finally is The bells are, in some sense, broken up, and AT&T can become a publicly listed company. AT&T is one of the most powerful companies in America for a long time. But what happens to AT&T's Bane service, which is landline telephones? They go the way of the dinosaurs because we have cell phones now. And in fact, you look across all these different industries, you have, IBM, the dominant industry, Apple and Microsoft 20 years later completely upset IBM's market dominance. Beyond, 15 years after that, Google now is much larger than either of those companies. So part of Schumpeter's account is that this is another dynamic that's unleashed by open access orders that helps deal with this problem of the economic exploitation of political power. If we have actual dynamism, the dynamism that open access creates, then you can constantly have a kind of revolutionizing of both technology as well as economic power, which means it's going to be hard for those in economic power to have a permanent coalition that ends up monopolizing political power. Again, the big caveat is this would be disastrous, open access orders, if all they did was unleash economic dynamism without separating economics and politics. Because if you could have economic interests change the rules of fair competition, eliminate competition, or simply take wealth through political processes, this would bring the incentive structures of the political economy to a halt. This would bring us back to a kind of natural state. And so this is, in many ways, if you were kind of using American political experience as a lens through which to think about what are the larger normative ideals of what should politics be, who should it serve, how can it operate in a sustainable way through its institutions, I think there's two kind of concerns that we inherit. One is this concern about economics corrupting politics. The standard account, you saw it in the half of my reading that I assigned, is what public choice economists will talk about rent seeking. And
or they switched to corn syrup.
Oh,
You might wonder why they made the change.
let's see.
Did you know that?
Here we go. Here's one many stories of rent seeking. You've seen, this is from a libertarian
Did
organization.
you know that Coke used to be made with cane sugar in the U.S.? But in 1984, they switched to corn syrup. You might wonder why they made the change. They did it to save money. It turns out that sugar in the U.S. is about twice as expensive as it is in the rest of the world. But why is that? Well, it can be explained by a concept economists talk about a lot: concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. Let me explain. In 1982, President Reagan reimposed a quota on imported sugar. Quotas restrict the amount of a good that can be imported to the U.S., which reduces the supply of sugar and protects domestic producers from foreign competition. When you reduce the supply of sugar with a quota, the price rises. That's simple supply and demand economics. As a result, American consumers pay more for sugar and products that contain sugar than they would without a quota. A Commerce Department study estimated the cost of the quota to consumers at roughly $3 billion a year. So why would the government put a policy in place that hurts the majority of consumers and voters? Wouldn't that be political suicide? Actually, no. Because the $3 billion cost is very dispersed among the whole population of consumers, each of us individually pays only about $10 more on sugar products a year, so we don't even notice it. Most of us have no idea this quota even exists. And even if we do know about it, who's going to take the time to complain to the government or spend money to lobby to change the law? All that trouble over $10 a year? Meanwhile, the benefits of the quota are very concentrated. Between 1980 and 1998, each American sugar farmer made roughly $3 million a year extra as a result of the quota. So each of them is willing to spend a lot of time and money making sure the law stays that way. They sent lobbyists to DC to talk to politicians because they need the quota to protect them from foreign competition. If the quota were removed, they would lose a lot of money, and some of them might even go out of business. So from a lawmaker's perspective, you have one side giving you all the reasons why the policy is so important, arguing we need the jobs or the industry or whatever their case is, and you have another side that hardly speaks up at all. Which way are you going to vote? It's pretty obvious. Concentrated benefits and dispersed costs. This simple concept explains so much of the policymaking and money spending that goes on in Washington. So what can we do to improve accountability and get rid of wasteful spending? Unfortunately, as long as we allow government to make policies that only benefit a certain group, that special interest will have a big incentive to get involved in politics. If we don't want large agribusinesses and other big corporations lobbying for these benefits, the only real answer is to limit what the government can do. More regulation or oversight won't fix the problem.
So that's the sort of a very standard economic account of how special interests end up lobbying government, and they can do so because of concentrated benefits and diffuse costs. You know, her kind of preferred solution there is you restrict the scope of what a government can do. As you'll notice in Wallace's reading, some of the changes in the constitutional structures of American states specifically prohibited what was called special benefits. So this is the idea that you couldn't, as a state, just carve out money and give it to Joe, but you had to, you actually had this language. That's much harder. I mean, it's hard to do because it requires a lot of questions of judgment, and special benefits can often be reframed in terms of, larger public spirited projects. So that's going to be a complicated question, and it's going to be something that when you think about how is the stuff that Lessig talks about, the economies of influence, what is their actual institutional form and the incentives they set up in Congress, and why is that dangerous? This is sort of one standard concern. It's the economic corruption of politics, the special interests that will use the political process to benefit them. But there's let me speak very quickly. So we often think about these as subsidies or transfers of wealth, but relevant to Schumpeter's question about innovation and new ways of developing things, new services, new ways of helping people. A related concept is this problem of barriers of entry. So I mentioned in my reading, let me just ask you in general, how much training should be required to be a barber, a hairstylist? How much barber school should be needed for you to have a license? Just be your own opinion. It doesn't have to be what the state of California requires.
7 or 8 years.
Okay, 7 years a barber. Do you come from a family of barbers? Okay. Okay, do you like haircuts? Okay, I see, yeah.
I'd say 0.
So you think 0. You want unlicensed barbers out there.
It's not a matter of life or death, so I don't see why regulation is a proper sphere of government responsibility.
Okay, I got a haircut once. I got a haircut a few weeks ago that made me think it was more important than you do. But 6 months, okay. So you think you have to go to school for 6 months before you can be allowed to cut hair. Okay, so the sense of the people here is diverse, and let's admit that there could be arguments on this. As you saw, in California, it is, I believe, a year that you need to go through barber school, and anybody is not allowed to cut hair in California unless you have this. It turns out we can do comparisons, and states that don't have barber license requirements appear to have no more medical injuries or dissatisfied customers and that sort of thing. But it's an empirical question, and it's an open question. How many hours of professional instruction should shampoo specialists be required to have before they work in a salon? None. Ooh, okay. So that's a big switch there. From you're big on you're worried about somebody cutting your hair, but shampooing it you think is easier. Okay. Anyone want to argue with that?
3 weeks.
Okay, 3 weeks. Stuff can go wrong there. I don't like getting shampoo in my eyes. There's a lot of things. I want somebody to be qualified. 3 weeks, I think that's a reason. Okay. Was there yeah.
Or you can just require people to report like a certificate or something that reports how much education they have got, and don't have any formal requirement of like how much you have to get, and people can choose whatever they want.
Now, is a suggestion that if I have a degree from Harvard, I'll be better equipped to shampoo, so that education is a proxy for competence?
However much professional training in whatever they're doing.
Is currently the norm. Aha. Well, I can tell you that in Texas, so as you saw in the reading, you have to do 150 hours of training to be a shampoo specialist. And that probably before that law, and of course, who advanced that law? There were a lot of people in the salon business that basically didn't want a lot of new salons opening up. And probably before that, I'm guessing that 150 hours wasn't the norm, but this is something that was lobbied for because it would provide these protections. And perhaps there's an open question of whether or not this is legitimate. Should someone need a license to give a therapeutic massage? Okay, very reasonable. What should the penalty be if you don't have a license to give a therapeutic massage? How what? I see. So you tit for tat, an eye for an eye. They have to be subject to an unlicensed massage if they. But realistically, I think there's an argument for therapeutic massages for a lot of insurance reasons, stuff that be licensed. So if you provide an unlicensed therapeutic massage, a fine. I think there's at least 2 states that put you can go to jail for up to 5 years, and it's a felony charge. Because we gotta make this stick. We gotta protect therapeutic massage. So again, these are some of the more ridiculous examples. But again, this is the sort of challenge that any political economic order has: is we're going to erect a lot of laws, and these laws are going to have a lot of power. They're going to themselves shape institutions, but there are going to be interests influencing them, interacting with the development and creation of these laws. And how can we have a gatekeeping mechanism that ensures we get good public policy rather than special interest kickback? So again, this is the economic corruption of politics. But there's a reverse that Wallace talks about too, and that's that if politics and economics become more and more closely entwined, you can have the political corruption of economics, that this can work the other way. This is some of you may have heard, this is actually the phone call that Eleanor Holmes Norton, who is a DC congressional representative, left on a lobbyist voicemail.
Eleanor Holmes Norton. I noticed that you have given to other colleagues on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I am a senior member, a 20-year veteran, and am chair of the Subcommittee on Economic Development, Public Buildings, and Emergency Management. I'm handling the largest economic development project in the United States now, the Homeland Security compound of 3 buildings being built on the old St. Elizabeth's Hospital site in the District of Columbia, along with 15 other sites here that are part of the stimulus. I was frankly surprised to see that we don't have a record, so far as I can tell, of your having given to me, despite my long and deep work. In fact, it's been my major work on the committee and subcommittee has been essentially in your sector. I'm simply candidly calling to ask for a contribution. As a senior member of the committee and a subcommittee chair, we have obligations to raise funds, and I think it must have been me who hasn't, frankly, done my homework to ask for a contribution earlier. So I'm trying to make up for it by asking for one now when we particularly need contributions, particularly those of us who have the seniority and the chairmanships and are in a position to raise the funds. I'm asking you to give to Citizens for Eleanor Holmes Norton, P.O. Box 70626, DC 20024. I'll send you a follow-up note with appreciation for having heard me out. Thanks again.
Okay. So that it's not necessarily a quid pro quo. It's just saying, look, I'm an important person on this subcommittee. We're doing work in your sector. Presumably, you like what I'm doing. I could use your support. So even if it's not extortion, though, there's this question of, is this a healthy relationship between politics and economics? Should those who are, say, in whatever building sector involved with construction, should it be the understanding that unless they contribute, they're not going to be part of this new project? So the final thing to note is, so you have these 2 concerns. It's a corruption of economics, corruption of politics by economics, the corruption of economics by politics. And so we think like there can be both substantively bad things that go on in each of these directions, but there's this enormous cost in the background of even setting up this game as the way in which power and influence and wealth operates. You can think if we had a competition in this class, something like a $10,000 prize, since nobody won the actual lottery jackpot. A $10,000 prize, and the prize is going to be given for the best 5-page essay answering what's your favorite celebrity. This will be the nature of the competition. unfortunately, we're paying for this out of your tuition money, so this is an expense that you all are eventually paying for. In the first instance, you might think this is or isn't a good idea. And that's a substantive discussion we can have. Should we reward the best essay with this amount of money that we've collected from everybody else? But there's this peculiar thing that is going to happen even in opening up this competitions game as a way to get wealth. And that is this, that we have 150 people in the course. And let's say you each spend 10 hours. And let's say you're highly skilled people, and let's say your time is worth $10 an hour. At least. So very quickly, it turns out that you would be expending in mass something like $15,000 worth of effort for us to give away a $10,000 prize. So that there would actually be, whether or not you think this is a good thing, a good prize, a good contest, we're going to be destroying more wealth in the process than is actually created. Now, there will be one big winner, and that winner is going to probably have invested a lot of time in that competition. They're going to put a lot of effort in there, and they're going to be very happy with that outcome. They probably do it again. But for the other 149 of you, you're going to be disappointed you didn't win, and we're going to aggregately burn more wealth than we actually created in this little society right here. So sort of these three related concerns, corruption of economics by politics, corruption of politics by economics, and the costs of certain competitions, the cost of making this an influence peddling game rather than a game where you make money by creating good things that help other people, whether that be in economic circumstances as a business or whether as a politician you actually do things that are useful to a wide group of people. That's the sort of competition we want. And the cost of some rent-seeking competitions can actually be much more than they're worth from any economic calculation. So these are sort of the concerns regarding the relationship of money and politics to have in the back of your head as we think about the alignment of incentives. But the larger thing I want to propose in this presentation, the reason we had you do these readings for today, is that you need to be thinking hard about what is the normative ideal for politics. You know, if you're going to call something corrupt, it's easy to call certain third world dictatorships corrupt because of the kind of explicit quid pro quo legible bribes that we know people have to pay. But if we're going to talk about corruption in more developed economies, then we should have in the back of our minds some account of what a good economic political order looks like and how those relationships and incentives are achieved. Northwaltz and Weingast give you one account of that. There are strengths and weaknesses of it. You can take it or leave it. There's an optional reading that was also posted for today that you get a little bit more in-depth of their account if you find this interesting. But it's going to be incumbent upon you, if you diagnose and make claims about institutional corruption in politics, to say, what does a good political order look like? And you can ask whether this is sufficient or whether you want to add something else. We've thought about democratic incentives in voting. Now we've thought in a bit more general way about the institutionalized relationship of economics and politics. Let me stop there. Are there questions, any questions so far about these two sort of typologies or models of political economy and the sort of dangers and benefits that each of them have? Yes?
Is there a difference between the terms like gift economy and natural state?
So yeah, that's a great question. So a gift economy we're using as a generic term of ways of relating to other peoples based on personal relationships, reciprocity, exchange of goods and favors and gifts. And that can, I think that can operate in any circumstance. We can call gift economies, you have a gift economy related with some of the clubs that you're in as a student of uncalculated giving and receiving and mutual friendship and benefits. So that can be used very generally, I think. And there's sort of two ways in which it interacts today is very specifically, Lessig's argument is that you have something like a gift economy operating in Congress in the way people peddle political influence, which has this interesting feature that it's not going to be obvious and legible in the same way traditional quid pro quo corruption is legible, but it's still going to be highly influential. So that's one sort of extrapolation of this concept of a gift economy to a specific circumstance. And in terms of its relationship to the natural state, I think you can also, this is sort of an analogy, that in the same way you think about the kind of personal ties and relationships that you generate all the time and the hold those have on you, think of a lot of natural states as sort of those relationships expanded and as one of the fundamental sinews of those political societies. So that it's you get ahead by joining the party, by sucking up the people, which is sort of an extreme kind of gift economy relationship there. But you do so because other alternatives of distinguishing yourself aren't available. So you can't, if you have a great idea, you need to first ingratiate yourself to somebody. You can't just go out and found it and try it and do a startup. So that would be the sort of contrast. Okay, great. So failing that, we're done for today, but let me remind you for sections, on Monday, it'll be posted. Monday will be in Kirkland's SCR. If you can't make that, please do come to another section. And we do have the new section on Friday at 2 p.m. If you'd like to switch into that, shoot Mark Hannon an email.